Good morning, church. I'm Michael Airgood. I'm the gospel storyteller here at Pine Run, where we worship at 11, as well as Glassport United Methodist Church, where we worship at 9:45. Both churches would love to have you with them in worship. Today's sermon comes from Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, the beginning of Mark's Gospel. There's a Nigerian author named Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's popular all around the world. Her books have been bestsellers and translated into languages all around the world. She gave a powerful TED Talk a number of years ago. A TED Talk is a short, direct message to an audience. We call it a sermon in the church, but Miss Adichie gave a powerful message about the danger of a single story. She tells her experience at college in America with an American roommate who was excited that she was from the dark continent of Africa. The roommate asked about the poverty and the famine and the malaria and the horrid images she had learned represented Africa. She asked her new Nigerian roommate to play the tribal music for her. And she was terribly disappointed when Chimamanda put on Mariah Carey. Her roommate had only ever heard a single story about Africa. A story of rural hardship and poverty and malaria and darkness. Miss Adichie, she grew up knowing struggle and hardship. But as the daughter of educators growing up in middle-class suburbs, this was a story of Africa that wasn't familiar to Miss Adichie. A story that seems quite familiar. I mean, even with years of such great encouragement and friends who were from Africa, when I traveled to South Africa for the first time, I will admit that one of the first things I said as we got into our bus outside was just how clean everything was and how horrific that this was the mindset that I had taken. Even as an adult with so many opportunities to know better. I knew many Africans, and still I couldn't divorce that single story that I'd always been told from the reality, or from the realities that exist for all people. You know, in literature they often talk about, people often write a prequel, telling the story before the main character, or they write a sequel. If you write a popular book, of course you want to hear the beginning of the story and the rest of the story, but there's a new movement going on in literary circles where fans are asking authors not to write prequels that could change the story in hard ways, or sequels that could reverse that beautiful ending that brought everything together, but instead to write equals. To write the exact same story, but from a different person's perspective. We know this well because we were given 4 Gospels, equal, but totally different audiences in mind, different storytellers sharing the story of the good news. We need different perspectives in our lives. We need to hear multiple stories. Matthew and Luke, in their Gospels, they tell the Christmas story that we know so well. They tell it a little different. There are some different elements, but Mark starts his Gospel in an entirely different way. He says, this is the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One. Now, in many translations today, they add on the words, the Son of God. But when Mark wrote his Gospel, he really wrote it almost as a mystery, a detective, as this unraveling, revealing of this beauty of the good news. In Mark's gospel, first it's the demons that Jesus is casting out who acknowledge him as the Son of God, and then it's a Roman soldier. It's a different story when you hear it this way. We think of skeptics and those who had never heard of Jesus reading their first gospel. Would they have become stuck on the details of the birth of Jesus in that story? Would they have found a moment of pause, something to doubt, that they wouldn't have listened to the rest, that they wouldn't have heard Jesus' message, the good news for all people, the call to rise up together in beloved community? You know, I often think about the folks who come to our churches on Christmas and Easter, our neighbors, our friends, our relatives, and I often wonder what it's like to only hear that part of the story. To just hear that one story that all you know of church together is this great excitement and beautiful music and lights everywhere and pageantry and pomp and circumstance. And I wonder what it's like to only have a single story of Jesus. This narrative of a baby born in a manger and then dead on the cross with nothing in between. That's a single story that is hard. Sounds so incredible. But when you hear the rest, it makes the story grow. It gives the story wings to hear the words of Jesus, to see him serving and loving others. What if the Christmas and Easter folks knew the rest of the story? The compassionate healer, the angry justice advocate, the tearful friend, grieving, the suffering servant. Miss Adichie was an early reader and an early writer, and her first books, they were all British and American. And so when she wrote her first childhood books in colored pencil and crayon, all of her heroes were blonde-haired and blue eyes like the heroes she knew in her British novel, and they drank ginger beer, and they loved Turkish delights, things that she knew nothing of. Chimamanda, she thought that books could only be about white people. She had never read a book that featured an African like herself as the hero. She needed more than just a single story. She needed to see her own story told as well. When I was a little kid, I had this old 1980s book, real flimsy material, but it was really an anti-Soviet propaganda children's book. And I don't know how this ever landed on our shelf, but it showed on each page those poor communists. And everyone wore, the same gray suit. Everyone looked the same sad faces. They stood in line holding their lunch pails on the way to their awful factory jobs. And I understood that those poor folks in Russia, how awful their life must be. Years later, when I was an exchange student to Russia, it's easy to go to Russia and to see people not smiling and to have that idea confirmed. But a few months in to being an exchange student, I found this children's book about America. And it was basically the same book. Gray outfits, standing in line, holding their lunch pail, sad faces as those American capitalists went to their job every day that was terrible, but they had to survive. We each wrote a propaganda book about the other, and we each believed that single story, no matter if it was real in some places but not others, or completely fiction. It matters how we hear the story, where it starts and what questions it leaves us with. So why does Mark leave out the miraculous story of Christmas, of the birth of Jesus Christ? Because the people reading Mark, he intends for them to be skeptics, to come to this book without any knowledge of Jesus, and they don't know this story yet. And the birth narrative, this story of Mary in a manger giving birth to Jesus, it requires a lot of faith. We need to trust Mary's story and her fiancé who says he saw the angels too. It takes deep faith to believe in the Immaculate Conception. So Mark starts the story in a way that invites the readers to find their place in the story, to feel like you are right in the thick of it. He knows that after his readers have heard the good news, that they will want to read every word, that they will hear the story of the birth of Christ in miraculous ways. Amen.
Mountains and valleys will have to be made plain. Open new highways for the Lord. He is now coming closer, so come all and see, and open the doorways as wide can be. In lowly stable, the promised one appeared, yet feel his presence throughout the earth today, for he lives in all Christians and is with us now. Again with his coming, he brings us liberty.
Friends, go in peace this day. A peace that passes all understanding. May your days be filled with the joy of the one who came to celebrate, to live in joy and hope for all eternity. Go in peace. Amen.